This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. The common narrative around dairy in Vermont is that small dairy farms and processors are suffering. In some ways, yes, that's true. But a decade ago, the state had fewer than 100 processors turning local milk into other dairy products. In 2023, it had 158. Surprise! A new report from the Agency of Agriculture details the ways in which the dairy industry has changed over the past decade. Later in the show, we're going to learn all about the report's big takeaways, including some other surprises. But first, U.S. tariffs on imports from most other countries have increased tension over trade. And in some cases, prices of imports into the U.S. have gone up, and the popularity of our exports out of the country has dropped. With the frequent changes to tariffs that we're seeing, Vermont business owners, including farmers, are trying to keep up. Tucker Diego is one of the staffers at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, tasked with tracking the tariffs' effects on local ag. He's the agency's assistant director for food safety in the Consumer Protection Division. He joins us today from Montpelier. Tucker, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you. And listeners, you can join this conversation as well. As I said, in this first segment of the show, we'll be discussing the tariffs' impacts on agriculture. So if you work in ag, perhaps you're a farmer or a farm worker, or you run a food stand, tell us how the tariffs have affected you or your business so far and what your concerns are for the future. You can give us a call at 800-639-2211 or send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Tucker, as I understand it, your job typically involves making sure that Vermont agricultural products meet state standards before they're shipped out of state or sold on shelves. How has your job shifted in the last couple of months as these new tariffs have been put in place by the Trump administration?
Yeah, so we've been tracking the impact of tariffs for about 2 months now, knowing that it was had the potential to have a big impact on our farmers and producers. This isn't my normal job, though. This is in addition to everything else I'm working on. So it's been a learning curve for me, and it's helped me kind of broaden my perspective and get in touch with all our different ag sectors, from dairy, maple, produce, meat, and even our vineyards as well. Everyone's been impacted by this. Your
specialty is around maple and maple syrup, right? Tell us a little bit about, for those who aren't familiar, the connections between Vermont's maple industry and our neighbor to the north, Canada.
Yeah, so maple is one of the commodities we're looking at heavily in terms of these tariffs, and it happens to be part of one of my backgrounds. And it's fascinating. Initially, when the tariffs were proposed in February, there was going to be a 25% tariff on goods imported from Canada in particular, which would include a significant amount, hundreds of thousands of barrels of Canadian syrup that comes into Vermont, is processed in Vermont facilities, and then distributed nationwide as Canadian syrup. And the reason that happens is because even though Vermont produces the majority of syrup in the U.S., of U.S. production, Vermont doesn't have enough syrup to supply the national and international demand. So we actually bring Canadian syrup in, it gets packaged in our facilities, and then gets shipped out. And when the tariff, the 25% tariff was announced, we were very concerned and wanted to better understand how this would impact our Vermont maple economy. It had the potential to increase the demand for Vermont syrup, which was potentially a benefit. The reality of that tariff has changed over the months.
Yeah, can you update us on it? 'Cause it's so complicated sometimes to see the headlines around these tariffs and understand what's actually been put in place, what's been rolled back. There's so many changes.
Exactly, and that's a really important tariff to focus on the Canadian and also the Mexican tariffs, because those two countries are part of the U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which replaced the NAFTA trade agreement. And so initially it was announced 25% tariff on imports from those two countries. That got amended or clarified, I think it was in March, by the Trump administration to say that goods that are imported from those countries that are compliant with that trade agreement won't receive additional tariffs. And so to be a compliant good, the good has to originate from one of those countries. So maple syrup is pretty straightforward. If it was produced in Canada and imported into Vermont, as of today, there shouldn't be an additional tariff on that. And that's something that changed over the months since we've been tracking this.
I also know we talked a little bit about Mexico and Canada, but that China is a leading importer of American agricultural products like soybeans, for example. And those are coming out of a different part of the country, of course, than our region. But the price of soybeans has gone up exponentially, I think about 135% in response to Trump's tariffs on Chinese imports. Do Vermont farmers sell any products to China that are also seeing a similar increase in price?
Yes, we do. And by the way, the soybean prices in general, grain prices could affect us here as well based on those markets. But one of the key products that actually is sold to China is dry whey powder. And it's actually a pretty important product that gets sold from Vermont. It makes up a large volume and percentage of that industry's exports. And the trouble there is that there aren't great alternatives if we were to look at other buyers of that product. And it takes time to find other buyers and to secure other markets if you're going to look elsewhere. So that's one we've been keeping an eye on as well. If
you have questions about how the new tariffs could impact Vermont's agriculture industry, or if you're already noticing impacts on your farm or other ag-related business, you can call in at 800-639-2211 or email vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Let's talk a bit more about supplies that Vermont farmers and maple producers import from other countries like China and Canada. Are there other key supplies that are needed for our ag industry that might become or already have become more expensive?
Absolutely. And this is why we were focusing on this. We wanted to understand where the critical points and inputs, which ones were the most critical and going to be affected. So I'll give you some examples. One, potash fertilizer coming from Canada. I think around 90% of it is produced in Canada alone. And so in the early days, we thought that was going to receive a high tariff. And that's not something that can it can't be reproduced in the United States. That's used as a soil amendment to in our farmers' fields to grow their crops. So that was going to be significant. Again, that should be compliant with the trade agreement, and so that should not receive additional tariffs at the moment. Another example is sawdust used for animal bedding in the dairy farms and other for other animals. This is similar to the potash. We receive a lot of it from Canada, and that's something we were looking at and had concerns over. Now, one of the things we're seeing lately is that even if a product might not receive a tariff, the prices may have increased independent of whether there was a tariff applied to it or not. And
why?
We're not quite sure why, to be honest, but it might be because those suppliers are facing a higher risk of putting their product into the market and are just uncertain whether a tariff will or won't be applied. So we have had reports of price increases across the board, and we are concerned about that trend.
Price increases across the board. Are there any specific products that you've noticed that with?
The ones that come to mind are the animal bedding and grain in particular.
Okay.
But I would expect to see it other places potentially. Another area is packaging material. So I've had some reports of packaging material expected to increase or facing tariffs, for example, coming out of China.
So how do you go about collecting this information? Are you sitting down with farmers? Is there a survey? How does this information gathering work, Tucker?
Yeah, great question. I rely on the rest of our agency to kind of be the eyes and ears, and part of my role is just collecting it all and bringing it all together and sharing it with our leadership. But I've also made a lot of individual outreach to key producers across the various industries that I've come to know through my normal work, and that those relationships have been really helpful. At this time, we don't have a survey. Things have been changing so fast and so quickly, but there could be a time where we look at that as another option.
So I know that right now, Vermont state lawmakers in Montpelier are working on crafting this resolution that they might send to President Trump that would call for, quote, warm and cooperative relations between the U.S. and Canada. Now, to me, that seems mostly like a symbolic gesture of goodwill to our Canadian neighbors, more than perhaps a document that would actually influence the president's decision-making process. I do wonder if there is anything else that you believe from your seat at the Agency of Agriculture that the state government and your agency can do to reduce, if not the impact of these tariffs, perhaps the uncertainty around them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because there have been so many changes to the tariffs, it's been hard for me, and that's part of my job is to try and keep up to date with it. It's been hard enough for me, so I'm not surprised others are finding it hard as well. And so I think trying to share information is really critical, trying to strengthen relationships that we do have. And that's why I've been relying on some of those key industry contacts being like, hey, have you experienced any tariffs within the past month? Is this exemption actually happening? It looks like it should be happening on paper, but what are you seeing at the border? So I think that's all helpful, and just kind of reminding ourselves that we're all neighbors, even those to the north of us, and we're kind of all in it together to one degree or another.
Tucker, lastly, since I know your heart is in maple here in Vermont, let's close with that. How has the season been this year? Have you been able to focus on it much amidst everything else that you're now working on for the agency?
Yeah, I have. I might get a chance this week to be part of the Maple Festival as well, but I've heard it's been a really good year for some. It's always variable, but I think one of the bright spots to this tariff work and the maple industry in particular is that it's really focused some discussion on can Vermont increase its syrup production? What would that look like? And just underscoring the value of the maple industry in Vermont and in relation to trade with Canada and supplying the U.S. market.
And I'm glad you brought up the Maple Festival. It's the 3-day festival. It's held every year in St. Albans, and that's coming up this weekend. Tucker Diego is the Assistant Director of the Vermont Agency of Agriculture's Food Safety Consumer Protection Division. He's also been working on tracking the new tariffs' effects on Vermont's agricultural industry. Tucker, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Coming up, Vermont's dairy sector has changed pretty significantly over the past decades in some ways that you might not expect. We're going to learn more about its transformation in a minute on Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. When people think of Vermont and agriculture, chances are they're thinking milk and cheese. The Green Mountain State supplies New England with 2/3 of its milk. That's according to a new report from the Department of Agriculture called Vermont Dairy Delivers. It was commissioned by the Vermont Dairy Promotion Council. In 2023, the average American consumed 661 pounds of dairy products. That's up more than 40 pounds from the previous decade, and the highest rate of consumption since the late 1950s. But with more dairy alternatives on the market, what exactly is driving consumers to keep purchasing dairy products? And how are the producers themselves changing? Well, here to help us answer some of these questions is Laura Ginsberg. She's the Dairy Strategy and Innovation Manager for the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and she's going to help us dig through this new report. She joins us from our Montpelier studio. Laura, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And listeners, if you are a big dairy consumer or you've maybe switched to a dairy alternative, tell us why. Maybe you can shout out your local producer. You can call in at 800-639-2211 or send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Well, Laura, before we dive into this report, I just want to note that before moving to Vermont, you and your family ran a farm and made ice cream in Montana. So you know this industry really, really well, right?
That's correct. I didn't grow up on a farm or in a farm family. My dad was in the Air Force, but found my passion for dairy while studying abroad in New Zealand when I was in my early 20s. And for a while, my family and I did run a small farm and ice cream creamery in the western part of Montana and had a really great time doing that, and actually left that job to take the job that I have now with the Agency of Agriculture here in Vermont.
All right, so we have this new report out. And before we dive into the details, too, can you explain who exactly worked on and commissioned this report? Because I noted that the Vermont Dairy Promotion Council was involved, yes?
That's correct. So every dairy farmer across the nation in the state of Vermont, whether you milk cows, goats, or sheep, is required to pay into what's called the Dairy Checkoff Program. So that's an assessment on their income. And the state of Vermont receives approximately just over $2 million every year. And those funds are managed by a council of industry farmers. It's called the Vermont Dairy Promotion Council. And the Milk Matters report had been published in 2014, so it was time for an update. And in 2024, the council opted to put some funding towards redoing the report. So that project was managed by myself and the agency communications director. And we worked with an external firm to do the report, to do the imagery, and relied on a lot of data collection from many, many sources, just given the amount of new information and then updated information that we had to access and then consolidate.
So when the last report of this kind came out 10 years ago, I saw this article that quoted the Vermont Farm Bureau president, Clark Hinsdale, who said that at the time, Vermont was the most dairy-dependent state in the nation. Quote, dairy farming is a bigger percentage of our economy than any other product in any other state. Is that still true?
That is absolutely still the case. We are by far the state in the U.S. that has the most reliance on dairy farming as an agricultural sector of the overall state economy. And it's close to 2/3, actually, of all of our agricultural sales come from the dairy sector.
And how many dairies and processors are there in the state? How's that changed over the last decade?
So it's no real surprise if you look at national trends to see the number of farms declining. We are on par with the rest of the country for seeing farm closures, the majority of those being in the small to medium sizes. So we have seen a decreasing number of farms. It has slowed the first quarter of this year, which is good news. So we have around 450 dairy farms. The interesting thing about Vermont is that the number of processors that we have has doubled in the past 10 years. And that is a very unusual circumstance to see in the dairy sector and is a real testament to a number of things, primary of which is that we have an incredible consumer base that really values and prioritizes purchasing locally made food.
So there are fewer dairies, but more dairy processors. Are they using the same amount of local milk, or are they bringing in milk from other places?
Most of the milk that's used in Vermont processing plants is Vermont milk. What we see is that some processors are also farm operators, so they may have shipped all of their milk, say, to Cabot previously, and maybe they're using a little bit of their milk now to make farmstead cheese or putting milk in a bottle. So there are a number of different ways that this is happening. Where we see milk coming in from out of state primarily happens actually in the goat and sheep cheese world, where we just really have a real need for more milk. And most of that is coming from New York or from out of state. But many of the processors are either milking their own cows or they're diverting a small portion of milk from a dairy farm where the rest of their milk would go to a larger processor.
Well, let's bring in a caller here. We have Danny in Grand Isle on the line. Danny, go ahead.
Hi. I was really interested in this topic because I drink a very large quantity of dairy. I have always just been a dairy person, but I always keep an open mind and have tried lots of alternative products. But I always go back to dairy because it just tastes better.
Well, Danny, I'm sure that is music to the ears of many producers and processors here in Vermont. And Laura, according to this report, it sounds like Danny's not alone. There are a lot of Americans that are still choosing dairy, even with the increasing popularity of dairy alternatives.
That's correct. People are consuming more dairy than ever before. In most cases, that is that they're not drinking it. They are eating it as cheese or cottage cheese or yogurt or one of the other products that's made with dairy. Fluid milk, interestingly, for the first time in many decades, has seen increasing sales over the past 2 years as healthy fats have rejoined the cultural narrative as a healthy option for consumers. And so whole milk sales are increasing, skim milk sales are decreasing, and consumption overall is up.
And Laura, just a minute ago, you mentioned goat and sheep's milk. I noticed in the report that it said that 25% of North American consumers purchase goat milk products weekly. Now, that seems incredibly high to me. What am I not thinking of here?
It is really interesting to think about goat milk as a subcategory of the larger dairy case. And we've done some research at the Agency of Agriculture to understand consumer trends around goat and sheep milk products because there is much more demand than the products that we produce in this country actually to meet that demand. So many people approach and utilize goat milk regularly through cheese. So if you think about the cheese that's coming out of Vermont Creamery or Blue Ledge, where it's a chev or another type of maybe a goat milk feta that people are enjoying. But goat milk as a cow milk alternative is growing in popularity as people really start to understand maybe they're lactose intolerant or goat milk just settles better for their own particular constitution. So I think there is opportunities still for goat milk, but we do see people consuming and purchasing goat milk regularly, even if they're not really thinking about it, typically as cheese.
Oh, in March, Vermont Edition did a whole hour about sheep. And it was great to hear from some local sheep farmers in our region. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit more about the report's finding on sheep farming and what percentage of the total dairy industry that sheep make up.
So sheep make up a very small portion of the state's total dairy economy. We only have 3 sheep dairies in the state. We do have more cheesemakers making either mixed milk or sheep milk cheeses than sheep dairies. So we have maybe close to a dozen or so processors that make some variety of sheep milk product. And most of that sheep milk is coming from New York, which is, it's an interesting thing to contemplate that we have so much demand here in state, and yet we don't have the farms to meet that demand. And I think sheep are sort of an underrepresented species in the dairy world in this country. They're much more common in other countries, but sheep milk cheese tends to be at that really premium product price point. And there are some real opportunities around sheep milk dairy in this state. As a smaller animal, they don't take up as much space. There's management differences between a sheep and goat and a cow that are attractive to some folks. But I think goats are more interesting or more compelling than sheep at this moment in time in the small ruminant sector.
We got an email from a listener named Sarah with a question about subsidies. As you're talking here, Laura, about the level of demand for certain dairy products and how supply might not be meeting that demand, one way that the state can kind of pull some levers is by increasing taxpayer-funded subsidies for certain parts of an industry. Sarah wants to know how many taxpayer dollars are used to subsidize the dairy industry, and can you compare that to the plant-based milk industry?
That's a great question. So the state of Vermont does not provide much in terms of payments to farmers. There are some matching grant programs for water quality in particular. But as far as subsidizing business operations, we just don't have a program like that. The state of Maine has a program where farmers get a certain extra dollar or a couple dollars for the volume of milk that they produce, and that's in different tiers. The issue with Vermont having that kind of program is that we produce just so much milk that a program would not be financially viable for the state taxpayers to support, to make a meaningful difference for those farms. So there's not really that particular level of investment, and there's really no investment of state dollars that I know of that's going into plant-based alternative beverages.
But we do talk about farm subsidies, so that means we're mostly talking about federal dollars.
Right. There would be some federal funds coming in, particularly if people have a crop loss or feed storage loss. There have been some programs around milk income loss, which is more like an insurance program on milk that dairy farmers have the opportunity to enroll in. But again, those wouldn't be state dollars. It would be federal taxpayer dollars. And many of those programs actually haven't been providing any funding over the past couple of years because the price of milk has been really strong and the price of feed and other farm inputs have been lower.
If you're just joining us, we are talking with Laura Ginsberg of Vermont's Agriculture Agency about a new report that details how Vermont's dairy industry has changed over the last decade. If you've noticed some of those changes, you can call in or email us at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Maybe a beloved dairy farm near you has closed or a processor has opened up. Our number is 800-639-2211. Laura, I'm wondering if the report tells us anything about who the quote-unquote typical Vermont dairy farmer is and perhaps how that's shifted over the last decade.
Over the last 10 years, we have seen a pretty dramatic change in the dairy sector. And again, like I said earlier, it's not really different than what's happening across the United States. I think for Vermont, because we are a small state and for over 100 years, the ag economy has been really driven by dairy and dairy sales, is that we are starting to feel that much more acutely. So Franklin County, Addison and Orleans, they continue to be the largest producers of dairy in the state. They have the most number of farms. And actually, Franklin County is the largest dairy producing county in all of New England. So there are some really interesting things happening. Farms are getting larger as those economic pressures are driving them to find those economies of scale. What we also see is that small farms, really small farms, less than 50, 75 cows, they're also able to hang on and be competitive in interesting and different ways than a large farm, primarily because they don't rely on so much labor. So across the state, when you think about the geographies of Vermont, what we see is that there's small and medium-sized farms in hill country. I live down in Tunbridge. You just can't have a large farm in a town like Tunbridge. And so the state is bifurcating in these really, I think, quite fascinating ways for how the sector is going to be competitive, with the western part of the state and the northern part really able to house larger farms, and then the central and eastern parts really not able to have farms at the scale because the land base is so different outside of the Connecticut River Valley. And then the goat farms and sheep farms, they're kind of spread around all over. They tend to be smaller land bases, even if they do have several hundred animals in their dairy herd. And those opportunities are sort of different than the cow space just because of the way the animals are housed and fed. But in the cow space, there is a lot of evolution in how the sector is changing. People are seeing lower access to veterinarians, equipment dealers, grain dealers, other services like that they used to have no problem accessing. But now as farms in some counties get into the single digits, it's becoming much more of a challenge for those operations to remain in existence.
Well, we have to take one more quick break here, but we're going to keep this conversation on Vermont dairy going when we come back. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just joining us, we are discussing the state of the state's dairy sector. A new once-every-decade report from Vermont's Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets details those changes. Our guest is Laura Ginsberg. She's the Dairy Strategy and Innovation Manager for the Ag Agency. Let's get right into some calls, Laura. We have Alex calling in from Brattleboro. Alex, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Nice to hear this. I wasn't sure because I came in kind of late, but I was always fascinated to know that at one point there was a kind of a war between the sheep farmers and the dairy farmers as to who was going to get grazing rights. But one of my dear friends, somebody I went to high school with, is a shepherd, and he makes world-class, world-recognized sheep cheese. His name is it's called Vermont Shepherd Cheese, and he's been very successful doing that. He has a cave and everything like that. So it's very interesting. I know he grazes all his sheep out. They're not fed inside. They're all grazing on the.
Well, Alex, thanks so much for highlighting that. And Laura, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the pasture competition between sheep and dairy farmers, or sheep and cows. Excuse me.
Right. I think so. In the early 1900s, Vermont was a sheep state for many, many decades, providing wool for clothing. And in the late 1800s, the demand for wool declined quite precipitously. And at that point in time, the next best thing, and really what continues to be the best thing for Vermont's working landscape, is dairy in terms of economic returns and economic viability and access to markets. And so at that point, when the wool market started to crash, and dairy farming started to take over some of those farmlands and fields, I believe that there was sort of this cultural loggerheads around which industry would be the dominant one, and it ended up being dairy and has been that way since.
Well, Laura, I want to ask you about the environmental concerns that many Vermonters have that stem from the dairy industry. We got an email from a listener named Jack who says that he drinks oat milk to save the environment rather than milk from cows. We also got an email from Sarah voicing their concern about the environmental damage done by the dairy industry, which pollutes Lake Champlain and waterways, Sarah writes. And I noticed in this report that it says that Vermont dairy is, quote, the number one catalyst for improving water quality in Vermont. Is that sort of fancy PR speak for saying that Vermont dairy is leading to a lot of concerns over water quality?
Right. And I know people are concerned about dairy's impact on water quality. What I will say is that from a farmer perspective, having clean water, a clean environment, a landscape that is productive for their animals and for their business is the number one priority. And they also live in Vermont and partake of, beautiful Lake Champlain or other lakes and rivers for their own recreation as well. Vermont farmers follow the law. They follow state law, and the Water Quality Division at the Agency of Agriculture and the colleagues of ours at the Agency of Natural Resources work really hard to ensure that farmers are following the laws and how they operate and responding to concerns. I do think that there are often times where accidents happen. And that can be devastating for a farmer to have an accident where maybe there is a manure spill or something happens, but they respond to it, and they respond to it according to what the law says that they have to do. And looking at impacts to phosphorus in Lake Champlain, the farm community and the dairy farm community has been the largest sector to make improvements and has had the largest impact on those water quality improvements over the past 5 to 10 years as those programs have really come into effect and help farmers make the right decisions for their own fields.
Well, I know many of our listeners might agree with that statement, agree quite strongly that Vermont farmers follow the law. I know some folks might not, including people who live in Addison County who have been following the case involving the Vorstevelt farm. And just to catch folks up here, in 2020, they were sued. The three brothers who owned the farm were sued by neighbors about runoff that ran into Lake Champlain, and they were ordered by a judge to stop the runoff. Last year, they were found in contempt of court for not doing enough to mitigate the problem. And the brothers hold that complying with the order would essentially kill their business. And this case has been getting relitigated in the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. It's gotten very emotional at times. And it kind of centers in part around Vermont's existing so-called right to farm laws, which say that farming activity is protected from lawsuits if it's consistent with good agricultural practices. Has the Agency of Agriculture taken a public stance on whether Vermont needs to update this right to farm law or taken a stance on this case in particular?
I know that Secretary Anson Tebbetts and our agency legal counsel have been engaged in those conversations. Unfortunately, that's sort of outside of the realm that I exist in and really can't provide any specific comment on that.
Well, we do have a caller with thoughts, I think, on this general topic of dairy and the environment. It's Alan in Craftsbury. Alan, what is your comment or question?
Well, I just wanted to, thank you for taking this. I just wanted to comment. Your guest there, claims that the state doesn't directly subsidize dairy, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge that especially the large dairies are subsidized in the form of most of our expenditures to try to keep Lake Champlain from collapsing.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, so by the state trying to protect water quality and improve water quality in Lake Champlain, you're saying that that's in some ways a subsidy of the dairy industry, which is leading to runoff into Lake Champlain. Is that what you're...
Those expenses are ones that we wouldn't have to those are expenses that we wouldn't have if we didn't have large dairies pumping all these waste products, nutrients into the waterways.
Oh, Laura Ginsburg, I'm curious on your thoughts there.
So what the caller is referencing, I believe, is water quality improvements that the state helps support through what's called a matching grant. And what's interesting, and I think many probably listeners don't realize, is just the cost of the project. So for a farmer to be in compliance with one piece of what they have to do, for example, is they have to have 180 days minimum of manure storage on their farm. And that makes sure that they are able to contain the waste products from the animals, but also not spread during the winter, because farmers cannot spread manure on snow or on frozen ground. So those projects cost a lot of money, sometimes millions and millions of dollars. And for a business that is not profitable every year, and the dairy sector, farms are typically profitable maybe 2 out of every 5 years, and that can change very quickly, as we're seeing right now, like with the earlier conversation on tariffs. And so for a farm to make the investments needed in these massive water quality projects, there is some cost sharing that is needed, particularly as regulations change. And that is one area of real need in the dairy sector, is continued investment in facilities as regulations change, because these businesses oftentimes the saying is, farmers are land rich and cash poor. There's just no real way for an operation to cash flow, in most cases, a project that may cost $2 or $3 or $4 million on a business of the size of the farms that we have in Vermont.
So you're saying essentially, if Vermonters decide we want a stable, if not growing, local dairy industry, and we want a clean Lake Champlain, there are going to be some significant state level subsidies.
Right. I think, well, I can't say that there are going to be subsidies. I think the state will continue to support the farm community in the ways that it can through the funding that's available to it, either through the federal government or through the state legislature, to support farms in making these improvements that we know work to support water quality. Yeah. And I would say it's not just Lake Champlain. There's other lakes, the Connecticut River Valley. Every farmer across the state is trying to do the best that they can with their operation. And some operations have huge impacts, or they have financial impacts of these projects. And other farms, really just because of where their family chose to settle 100 years ago, they actually don't have any water quality concerns in the same way. And so it really is quite variable from farm to farm and across the state in the ways that these particular regulatory requirements impact their operation and the level of investment that it takes for them to address them.
Well, Laura, we've talked a lot about the farms and farmers that own them. Let's talk for a moment about the farm workers who are hired to work at these dairies, particularly migrant workers. Does the report cover how the role that migrant workers play in Vermont's dairy economy and how that role might have changed over the last decade?
It does. We did include a section on farm labor, and there has been a lot of work done through University of Vermont and University of Vermont Extension and Cornell in particular on the role of migrant labor on dairy farms. Of the Vermont dairy farms that were surveyed, close to 94% of them have reported hiring migrant labor at some point in time. And of all the milk produced in the U.S., 75% of it is produced with the support of migrant farm workers. So it is important to recognize that these workers are part of our community. They're absolutely a critical foundational piece of the dairy economy in Vermont and across the nation.
And I'm guessing this is kind of too new to have been included in the report, but I'm curious if you know if we're seeing any effects of the Trump administration's crackdown on both illegal immigration and the increase in detentions and deportations on Vermont's dairies.
Yes. So I've been having conversations with the experts in this field around the impacts, because if migrant farm workers, say, were to just disappear and to go home or, leave the farm for a period of time, there's going to be a real problem. And it's going to be an immediate issue in that we will have farms with cows that go unmilked and not fed, because we don't have the labor base of people who live in this state as U.S. citizens to do those jobs. So people are very nervous. The farm workers themselves are reporting that they are leaving their farms less frequently. The farm owners who employ migrant laborers are doing more of the grocery shopping, running more of the errands, because there is just this fear and anxiety that if they leave the farm, something may happen to them.
Laura, in the minute or so that we have left, we've covered many elements of this report, but I'm curious if there are any other pieces that really surprised you or stood out to you that you'd like to highlight for our listeners today.
One of the things that I was really excited about was there's a graph of what Vermont milk is turned into. And we've never actually collected and reported this data before, so it's brand new to see really where Vermont milk, what products it's made into. And I think everybody knows that Vermont cheese is really a standout in the category. And actually 70%, just over 70% of all milk makes its first stop as cheese in one of our many processing facilities. And that to me is really exciting, because that's where the real opportunity is for Vermont dairy to continue to grow and find more consumers and really have sales across the United States and internationally is in the cheese space.
The cheese space, one of my favorite spaces to be in. Laura Ginsberg is the Dairy Strategy and Innovation Manager for Vermont's Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. Laura, thank you so much for talking us through this report today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And we will be sure to link to that report we've been discussing in the show notes for today's show and on vermontpublic.org. Before we go, I just wanted to give you a reminder, if you haven't heard our promos for tomorrow's show, that we're doing a really special broadcast tomorrow at noon. It's going to be a joint broadcast with our counterparts at the CBC, Radio Noon Quebec. That's an English language call-in show out of the CBC in Montreal. And we're going to be talking about the current state of Quebec-Vermont relations. Now, this is the first time we've done a show like this in conjunction with the CBC, and I think it'd be a really fun and hopefully very fruitful conversation and experiment. We're asking folks to let us know what you want to say to your neighbors on the other side of the border. You can think about that and then shoot us an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. You can also call in tomorrow during the noon hour, and we'll be taking calls from both Vermont and the United States and from Quebec and the rest of Canada. Anyone who's listening can call in. But again, shoot us an email with what you want your neighbors on the other side of the border to know at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. All right, that is all the time that we have for Vermont Edition today. Our show is directed by James Stewart. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Anna Berg is our intern, and our call screener today was Kelly Delorier. Our theme music was composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch up again soon.